They found this warship after 72 years, and what they pulled from the darkness changed everything. For 72 years, it sat there, silent, invisible, buried beneath thousands of feet of cold, black water, waiting the men who sent it down. They never wanted it found. Nothing stays secret forever. When the cameras finally reached it, when the lights cut through that darkness for the first time in 7 decades, what they saw should not have been there. And the moment the world found out, governments made phone calls, lawyers filed papers overnight, and one very powerful nation went completely silent. What was on that ship? Welcome to Deep Sea War Files, the channel where the ocean gives up its secrets and history is forced to tell the truth. Now, before we go any further, a quick word to those who are watching for the very first time, especially if you are someone who has lived long enough to remember when the news came on only twice a day. If you are above 50 years old, this message is for you specifically. You already know that the world does not always tell the full story. You have lived through enough to know that the most important things are usually the ones they don't show you. So do something your younger self would have done without hesitation. Hit that subscribe button. Not for us, for yourself. So that every time this channel uncovers something the world tried to bury, you are the first to know. Okay, and while you are here, drop a comment below. Just tell us one thing. Where in the world are you watching from right now? It does not matter if it is a small town or a great city. Every single location matters to this community. It began the way most great discoveries do, not with fanfare, not with headlines, but with a quiet signal that something was wrong with the map. In the deep waters of the Sibuyan Sea, Philippines, a research team operating under a private marine exploration company picked up an anomaly on their sonar equipment. The reading was dense, massive, and it was sitting at a depth that most equipment could barely reach. They almost ignored it. The team had been scanning for weeks. False readings were common at that depth. The pressure alone plays tricks on instruments, bending signals, distorting shapes, manufacturing ghosts from rock and sediment. But this signal did not move like rock. It had structure. On October 2, 2019, when the underwater cameras were finally lowered to the coordinates, the team fell silent. There she was. The Musashi, one of the 2 largest battleships ever constructed in the history of naval warfare, resting on the ocean floor, exactly where she had fallen on October 24, 1944. During one of the most devastating naval battles of World War II, she had been missing for 72 years. The ship measured 263 meters in length. She displaced 73,000 tons of steel. She was built in absolute secrecy by the Imperial Japanese Navy, and she was designed to be unsinkable. She was not. American aircraft struck her relentlessly during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. 19 torpedo hits, 17 bomb strikes. Over 1,000 men went down with her, and she disappeared into water so deep that for generations, her exact location remained one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Second World War. But what the cameras revealed that day was not simply a wreck, it was a vault. Because the Musashi did not go down empty. She was carrying cargo that the Imperial Japanese government had never officially declared. Documents, materials. And according to recovered intelligence logs cross-referenced only decades later, something far more significant than military equipment. The discovery was immediately reported to the highest levels of the Philippine government. And within 48 hours, Tokyo had already made its first move. What was in that ship? And why did an entire nation respond within 2 days? That answer comes next. It is a question that historians had avoided for decades, not because they did not know, but because some answers are expensive to speak out loud. When the Musashi went down in 1944, the Imperial Japanese Empire was already bleeding. Its supply lines were collapsing. Its fuel reserves were critically low, and its leadership knew, privately, what they would not yet admit publicly. The war was being lost, and empires do not go down without a plan. History has shown this pattern with ruthless consistency. When a dominant power senses the ground shifting beneath it, when the treasury begins to feel the weight of a coming collapse, those at the top do not simply wait. They move things quietly, strategically, through channels that will never appear in any official record. The Musashi was not merely a battleship. She was, according to recovered intelligence documents cross-referenced by independent researchers in both the United States and the Philippines, functioning as something far more deliberate, a transfer vessel. Now here is where the story becomes deeply uncomfortable for several governments. During the final years of World War II, Imperial Japan had been systematically looting occupied territories across Southeast Asia for nearly a decade. The Philippines alone had been stripped of gold reserves, cultural artifacts, and institutional wealth on a scale that is still being calculated today. This operation had a name. Historians call it Yamashita's Gold, named after the Japanese general Tomoyuki Yamashita, who oversaw much of the Philippines' occupation. The theory, supported by declassified documents, survivor testimonies, and repeated archaeological evidence, suggests that Japan moved billions in looted wealth through naval vessels in the final years of the war. Not all of it reached its destination. Some of it went down with the ships. When divers and underwater cameras examined the Musashi's internal compartments in detail, following her rediscovery, the structural analysis revealed something that did not match standard Imperial Navy warship configurations. Certain lower compartments had been reinforced. Not for ammunition, not for military hardware. The reinforcement pattern was consistent with heat density, static cargo storage, the kind of modification made when a vessel is carrying something that cannot shift, cannot be damaged, and cannot be lost. The Philippine government requested full disclosure from the Japanese government immediately. Japan acknowledged the discovery, and then said very little else. This is the moment where the modern business mind must pause and pay close attention. Because what the Musashi's cargo reveals is not simply a wartime secret. It reveals a strategy. When institutions, whether nations, corporations, or financial empires sense an approaching collapse, they do not distribute their most valuable assets outward. They consolidate them inward. They move quietly. They use vessels, literal or metaphorical, that will not attract attention. And they make certain that even if everything above the surface is destroyed, something survives below it. This is not history. This is a playbook, one that has been used by the Dutch East India Company, by the British Empire in its final decades, by multinational corporations repositioning assets ahead of regulatory crackdowns in the modern era. The Musashi was simply the version that got caught. The deeper question, the one that neither Tokyo nor Manila has fully answered to this day, is not what was on that ship. It is where it was going. Because the Musashi was not sailing toward Japan when she was struck. She was sailing away from it, and the coordinates of her intended destination have never been officially released. What happened next when lawyers, governments, and billion-dollar salvage corporations entered the picture? Was not a legal dispute. It was a war. There is an old principle that serious power operators understand deeply. He who controls the narrative of the past controls the leverage of the future. And the moment the Musashi broke the surface of public knowledge, every serious player in the room understood exactly what was at stake. This was no longer about history. This was about money, about sovereignty, about who gets to decide what a 72-year-old secret is worth and who gets to keep it. Within 72 hours of the confirmed rediscovery, 3 separate legal frameworks were already in direct conflict with one another. The first was Philippine territorial law. The Musashi rests in Philippine waters. Under International Maritime Convention, the host nation holds primary jurisdictional authority over any wreck discovered within its exclusive economic zone. That gave Manila the first legal position and, on paper, the strongest one. But paper and power are rarely the same document. The second framework was Japanese sovereign vessel law. Under international legal precedent, a precedent that Japan had spent decades quietly reinforcing through diplomatic channels, warships are considered sovereign property of their nation of origin, permanently, regardless of where they sink, regardless of how many decades pass. This meant Tokyo did not need to raise its voice. It simply needed to raise its lawyers, and it did. The third player was the one that neither government wanted to discuss publicly. Private salvage corporations, specifically, a network of American, European, and Southeast Asian marine recovery firms that had been quietly mapping the Sibian Sea for years before the official discovery was announced. This is the detail that changes everything. Because the discovery of the Musashi in 2019, attributed publicly to a team backed by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, did not happen accidentally. It happened after years of deliberate, funded, strategic underwater mapping operations conducted across World War II naval battle zones throughout the Pacific. Paul Allen's team found the Musashi, but they were not the only ones looking, and the ones who lost the race to find her did not walk away quietly. What followed was a legal conflict so layered, so deliberately obscured by diplomatic language and jurisdictional maneuvering, that most international media covered only its surface. The real battle was happening in rooms that do not appear on any public record. Japan argued sovereign immunity over the vessel itself. The Philippines argued territorial economic rights over anything recovered from its waters. Private interests argued contractual salvage rights based on the investment made in locating the wreck. And beneath all three arguments, running like a current that nobody wanted to name directly, was the question of the cargo. Because if the reinforced compartments of the Musashi contained what the recovered intelligence documents suggested, the legal value of that cargo would not be measured in millions. It would be measured in geopolitical leverage. Gold does not simply have a market price. In the right hands, at the right historical moment, gold has a political price. And that price is always significantly higher. This is where the modern entrepreneur and the serious business operator must stop treating this story as ancient history. Because this ownership battle, dressed in the language of maritime law and wartime sovereignty, is the same battle being fought today, in courtrooms in Luxembourg over digital asset ownership, in boardrooms in Singapore over data sovereignty, in regulatory chambers in Washington over who legally controls the infrastructure of artificial intelligence. The weapons are different. The structure of the conflict is identical. When something of enormous hidden value is suddenly surfaced, the first question asked by every serious power is never, "What is it?" It is always, "Who does it belong to?" Because ownership is not simply a legal status. Ownership is control. And control over assets, over narratives, over the economic output of discovered value, is the only currency that has never once been devalued in the entire history of human civilization. The Philippine government, as of this recording, has not authorized any recovery operation on the Musashi. Japan has maintained its position of sovereign immunity. The cargo remains on the ocean floor, and the legal frameworks surrounding it remain deliberately unresolved. That is not an accident. Unresolved ownership is itself a form of control. The final question is the one that matters most to every person watching this. Not what was on the ship, not who owns it, but what the entire story of the Musashi teaches the modern business mind about strategy, about survival, and about what it truly means to build something that lasts. Every empire that has ever collapsed believed right up until the final moment that it would not. That is not weakness. That is not ignorance. That is the most dangerous cognitive trap in the entire history of human enterprise. The unshakable belief that size is the same thing as safety. The Musashi was the largest, most heavily armed battleship the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever constructed. She was built to be unstoppable. She was struck 19 times by torpedoes, and she still went down. Here is what the serious business mind must extract from that fact. The Musashi did not sink because she was weak. She sank because the empire that built her made 3 strategic errors that are being repeated right now by corporations, governments, and individual operators across the global economy. And those 3 errors are worth more to understand than any MBA program currently being sold at any university in the world. The first error, the illusion of invincibility. The Imperial Japanese Navy built the Musashi in absolute secrecy. They believed that secrecy, combined with sheer scale, would make her untouchable. They told themselves that no enemy force could coordinate an attack powerful enough to bring her down. They were wrong. In business, this error appears every single day. It appears in the boardroom of the company that dominates its market so completely that it stops watching the edges. It appeared in Kodak, which invented digital photography and then buried it, because film was too profitable to threaten. It appeared in Blockbuster, which had every resource necessary to acquire Netflix in the year 2000, and chose comfort over vision. Dominance is not a fortress, it is a target. And the larger the institution, the more coordinates the enemy has to aim at. The second error, opacity without exit strategy. The Musashi was carrying cargo that has never been fully declared. That opacity, that deliberate concealment, was designed to protect value during a period of crisis. Instead, it buried it permanently. This is the error of the business operator who builds complexity without clarity, who structures assets through layers of concealment, offshore accounts, undisclosed partnerships, deliberately opaque supply chains, believing that what cannot be seen cannot be touched. But opacity without a retrieval strategy is not protection. It is a burial. The wealth that cannot be accessed in a crisis is not wealth. It is sediment, sitting at the bottom of a very deep ocean, generating nothing, serving no one. The third error, movement without destination. The Musashi was not sailing toward safety when she was struck. She was sailing toward a destination that has never been officially confirmed. She was moving deliberately, urgently, under full military escort, toward coordinates that her own commanders apparently did not record in any surviving document. In business, this is the entrepreneur who pivots frantically under pressure, who moves capital, restructures operations, changes direction, not because they have identified a better destination, but because staying still feels more dangerous than moving. Movement without a clearly defined destination is not strategy. It is panic wearing the uniform of action, and panic at scale accelerates collapse. It does not prevent it. Now, here is the lesson that sits beneath all 3 errors. The most valuable thing recovered from the Musashi was not gold, was not cargo, it's not intelligence documents. It was the confirmation of a pattern that repeats itself across every era of economic history, that the institutions which fall the hardest are always the ones that confuse power with permanence. The entrepreneurs and business operators watching this right now are living through one of the most volatile economic periods in modern history. Supply chains are being restructured. Currencies are being questioned. Artificial intelligence is redrawing the map of entire industries faster than most institutions can update their strategic plans. And in this environment, the temptation to build big, move fast, and assume that scale will provide protection is stronger than it has ever been. The Musashi was big. The Musashi moved fast. The Musashi had the full backing of one of the most powerful empires on Earth, and she has been sitting at the bottom of the Sibuan Sea for 72 years. The water does not care how powerful the ship was. The market does not care how dominant the company was. History does not care how confident the empire was. What survives is never the largest. It is never the loudest. What survives is always the most prepared, the most transparent in its own internal strategy, the most deliberate in knowing not just where it is going, but precisely why. The Musashi was found, but what she carried may never be recovered. And that, for the serious student of economic history, is not a tragedy about a warship, it is a warning. About every empire, every corporation, and every individual operator who builds without a plan for what happens when the water rises. This has been Deep Sea War Files. If this story made you think differently about strategy, about power, and about the hidden economics of history, share this with someone who needs to hear it. The ocean still has secrets, and so does the economy. We will be back to surface both.